Here we're going, okay?
Okay, do it.
All right. Hey, Cary.
Hey, Michael.
Good to have you here. Thank you for doing this. We're going to do a
Well,
little walkthrough,
good.
studio visit type chat for everybody who can't come in during the health crisis.
Sounds good.
Here's a view of the show. We're also on the laptop right now, which is the best we're going to get at the moment. We're going to come into the show. So, Cary, this is the first time you're seeing the show in the real, at least moving.
Well, I've been admiring that room for some time. It's beautiful, the proportions and the light in that room. I like that floor. Just on its own terms, the room is spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we're extremely happy with the show. I mentioned to you before we started, we had a couple who didn't get the announcement that we were not having the opening. So they came in and we had a beer and talked them through the show, and they were very impressed
Nice.
with the show. So you could say that the response has been very good.
Has it been 100% then? Good?
It's 100%. Exactly. It's been 100%.
Nice.
So I guess what we want to do is sort of have an informal-ish conversation / studio visit about the work. I know there's a lot in the room that has to do with painting that you've been doing in the past, and there are also some new moves in paintings, right?
That's kind of the way it always is. I look to what I've been doing as inspiration for where I'm going typically. And I'm always trying to push things forward. And sometimes those moves are quite large, and sometimes they're sort of slightly incremental. So for example, the painting that's pictured on the left there, this blue one that you have there, and it has a little form in the upper left. The top and bottom of that blue painting are essentially the same painting stacked on top of one another. So if you look at the upper right-hand corner of the painting, you'll see a red block, and then halfway down, you'll see a red block. And there you see the connection of the bottom of the top one and the top of the bottom one. Mm-hmm. And then I also added an earlier image in the upper left-hand corner, which is one of my splat forms, in a way that I wouldn't say this is directly inspired, but I look for things that I can remember that are similar to the kinds of things I think. So that if you think of the way Giorgio Morandi signed his paintings often, not always, he would sign a big sort of script Morandi down in the center of the bottom of the painting. Mm-hmm. And it always seemed like to me that that was some kind of additional gesture more than just the signature. So that splat form in that corner is in a way similar to that.
And you, when we were doing our studio visit, you also talked about Picasso a lot in terms of his signature, which really surprised me, because the signature in a Picasso as being part of or integral to the composition was something I had never really considered.
Well, in the case of Picasso, he signed his work in what would be sort of an expected way, in one of the corners, sometimes up at the top, sometimes at the bottom. But there was nothing that jumped out at the average individual that this was something to be focused on by itself. But his color sense was so profound, and his hand, in terms of the marks that he made, was so able that his signature alone is very much a work of art. And I think with the level of attention that he paid to everything, which is something that I also like a lot about his work, which is there's nothing extraneous. And so there are certain artists whose signature really does add that extra element. Monet, for example, always, it seemed, if I remember correctly, signed his name with a color. And if you were to take your finger and cover up the color of the signature in a Monet painting, you would see the painting deflate just a touch, because he knew that adding that color would give more life energy. I like to think of it that way. And that's very related to how I think about how I use color, even though right now we're just focusing on this red and blue, which is a similar thing. And then also you'll notice in this red and blue that I have a splat embedded in this geometry, which is in a way like something that doesn't seem like it would belong. And that's part of what interests me about it, which, just to take that idea one step further, I've always been a fan of how Ed Ruscha uses an image, maybe like if you're looking down on Los Angeles at night, and then he might have words painted across the front of that image. And the two things together make more than each of them do individually. And then even with Gerhard Richter, I remember at Marion Goodman seeing these big, huge scraping paintings, and then on one small wall, similarly to how this room is set up, where these 3 blue paintings are on one wall and all the colorful paintings are spread around on the other walls, that on this one wall in this big room with these big scraping paintings, he had a small painting of flowers, realistic painting of flowers that was blurred. I think he takes a brush with medium in it and blurs what he's painted that is sort of photographic. And that combination to me seemed a lot more interesting than if the room was just the scraping paintings or if it was just paintings of flowers. So it's using polarities, if you will, an A and a Z of the alphabet to create a mystery of all the letters in between that people will take in their beings to a place that's greater than the actual individual works. So, and go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm babbling.
No, it's great. One thing that's striking me as we're talking is that we're looking at a painting now that the main part of the painting is the splat, which in these other paintings was the kind of foreign object that showed up in these paintings, right? And here we have, instead of the splat being a signature mark, there's a small green circle, and that's the foreign body. So there's like this inverse thing happening.
Well, how do you get people's attention? All right. It's similar in a way to the way a good soccer player, they're running down the field. I was just watching this video of me talking a few months ago, and I used this example, so it's in my head. But if the good soccer player, like a really good soccer player, comes upon a situation that is not a good idea to keep going towards the goal, they'll kick the ball to someone beside them or even backward. And they move the ball around in order to eventually score a goal. And I think with art making, there's a similar thing that goes on. How do you orchestrate and like use the different tools that you have to get people who can see well to actually magnetically be drawn to what is in front of them? And so the idea of a splat embedded in a painting and then actually being sort of the more obvious subject of a painting within the same room, whether people see it or not, creates a sort of psychological dynamic that is attractive magnetically.
So are you talking about the way the splat bounces around the room and manifests itself in different ways in these paintings?
Yes.
And
yes.
To that end, do you see the installation being a work of art or a quasi work of art, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
100%. 100%. What I want to do is make shows that are an experience as a whole. But I also have learned, because I've believed that for a long time, that it's even cooler if you can make each painting stand on its own strongly, so that if someone takes one of the small little pieces of the show and puts it on a wall in somewhere else, that it will survive well on its own. But it's an opportunity when you have a whole room like this and you can do whatever you want with it. If you can orchestrate it in a way where it feels like one living organism somehow. Now, I suppose every art show, the artist feels that way to a degree. But when you're making non-objective, hard-edge painting that doesn't have an obvious story. In fact, the story within my work, I try to avoid there being any kind of obvious story. When that's the case, in a way, it's an advantage to accomplish this, because people are kept in the realm of the visual. A lot of people like to look at that yellow splat that's on the right of the picture there, and they'll think that looks like a tree, or it looks like a plant. And I hear that a lot, and it doesn't bother me because this is what everyone does. But as the artist who's making it, I actually don't do that. I try to just look at the visual, what's going on visually, and try to make it as absolutely right somehow as I can. So for example, with that circle in the corner that is a red, and then the pale yellow, paler yellow, then the ground color and the green, I moved that circle around on that line, trying to find the place where it felt like it belonged, even though in a way it doesn't belong. And all of that is very intuitive, but I stay in the zone of the visual as opposed to about some kind of story specifically.
And yet I feel like there is, if we think about narrative in a broader sense, it feels like there are these very kind of personal motifs and personal structures that are being deployed in this different way, and it does kind of have a familial vibe to it, right?
Yes, 100%. And I keep using, in fact, some of the same images over the years in different forms and different colors and so on. But they still, and it's interesting that you're making me think about the fact that the way I chose to title these paintings. And some of them are coming from an earlier period. So like the ovals painting that's on the right side of the screen right now, that's just called ovals number such and such, black, red, blue, yellow, something like that. So it's just a descriptive title. But all the new paintings where there are elements entering paintings, where there are new elements, I decided as a way of further describing how I don't want these to be about something that is, it's very describable, but it's not something realistic, let's call it that, literal. And so I've started giving the paintings these made up names. For example, the yellow splat we were just looking at is called Hudder Bloing, Hudder Bloing. Now that does have inside it a little bit of a story. Most of them don't, but Hudder Bloing, the word Hud is a tribute to an art dealer I used to work with named Hudson, who ran a gallery called Feature. And in one of my 2 shows with Fredericks and Freiser in New York, I had a yellow splat in the back that I called HUD as a thank you to him for being in his laboratory of a gallery and exploring in a completely free manner whatever I wanted to. And so the range of exploration was pretty great. And also the way that he was as an art dealer wasn't really like an art dealer typically. It seemed like he almost didn't care if he sold anything. I mean, he liked to sell things. He liked to sell your work, and he was very happy when he did, and he was very happy to give you a check, but like, it didn't seem like a driving force. And a lot of people who worked with him have talked about that kind of thing. So that painting in particular, Hudder Bloing, the word blowing to me feels like a juicy rubber ball explosion. And that painting so it's just this visual thing. I looked at the painting and the word blowing came into my mind. I wasn't trying to describe the painting, the word blowing came into my mind. So, and then when you look at the little yellow one in the middle of that wall that has in the lower left-hand corner, a corner that is red and black, the name of that painting, if I'm remembering correctly, is called Farstish Trinka. And that's because I made a larger painting that had that in the corner. That painting was in the corner of a larger painting with slightly different proportions, but the color arrangement was the same. And I liked that particular area of the painting enough that I decided to make a small version for this show, because I knew I wanted to have a group of small paintings.
So, Cary, can I interrupt just to clarify? This
Yeah.
whole painting had been
Yes.
a section of a larger painting.
Yes, but it was slightly different. Like the black diagonals in this painting were red. So the upper section that was all yellow had only red diagonals and verticals and horizontals. It had the colors around the outside, but the name of that painting was Schymester Stowe Tranquille. All right. So this painting, the Tranquille, and this painting is called Farstiche Trinka. I'm just using part of the original title to use as a inspiration for what the name of this ended up being. So this painting is called Farstiche Trinka, and those words to my brain sound like this painting looks. That's it, all right? But I don't want people to hear Farstiche Trinka and think to themselves, oh yeah, I remember when I was, on the beach and this happened, whatever. In that means something to them specifically. I want it to remain abstract. So yes, there's a familial quality to all the work and so on, and there's this cross-fertilization, and there's this infiltration of work into other work and so on. It's all abstract. It's all about what you see, and can it make you feel something? And that's something I'm really interested in. Is I want the work as orderly and mechanical as it might seem, to ultimately, when people who are open to, let's say, this kind of work, which, it's not exactly the current zeitgeist. I mean, my work is very clean, but it's also very handmade. I don't tape any of this work. I use little brushes, and I have this maul stick contraption that goes in front of the paintings, and it enables me to work on these lines with small brushes and then fill in with larger brushes. So upon close viewing, the paintings are extremely human, but it takes a certain level of acceptance to look at something like this and even get past the cleanly, hard-edged nature of it. But if someone does get past that and is interested, that I see these paintings as very, very emotionally, generous. I'd like to believe that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's just in the way they're made, there's this there's a tension between order and control, even this fastidious making of it, and then a free form composition, intuition, play, all these things, right?
Well, there's another part too that you're making me think of, which is if you look at that painting, there's something about it that has like a symmetricality, almost like a game board. If you look at the yellow section and imagine if the lower left-hand corner were a continuation of what's happening with the yellow sections, then it would have a game board-like quality. And that's very much on purpose, because I'm really attracted to the power of the logic in game boards. They're not looking like this. They're looking deadpan at you. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the arrows in my quiver. One of the things I'm really interested in is, can you make something that's very straightforward and kind of like your driver's license photo? Can you make that emotionally rich and generous? And then, the color obviously is a big part, a huge, huge part of what I do. I've always been particularly interested, and another reason that Picasso was so important. I mean, I'm not sure anyone has ever used color. People say Matisse is a greater colorist, but in terms of opaque paint, Matisse used a lot of thinned paint. It's very different. In terms of like opaque painters who use paint that you kind of can't see through easily. And Picasso used a lot of thinned paint too. I'm not saying that Matisse used a lot of opaque paint, but his knowledge of what colors would illuminate other colors. And I think the way that you get to the level of what he did is by having massive natural ability, all right, and also putting major time in, because when you come upon a discovery, like, for example, that Farstiche Trinka, was in the corner of a painting that I was working on, and I knew that that particular area of the painting was just having this energy, and that's why I remembered, okay, I'm going to use that. Same thing is true when you make a discovery. Let's say Picasso's painting a face, and the transition from the face to the hair, he puts this green line of a certain green that he doesn't use a lot, and he looks at the color of the hair and the green line and the color of the face, and he's like, all of a sudden, he's feeling something deeply that he's never felt before. I can promise you he's going to remember that. And so even though I've pared my color usage down to a fairly limited number of colors, I'm going to say maybe 12 to 15 colors exist in that room. And that's because when I was young, I used to make these watercolor paintings where I would put layer upon layer of watercolor on top of one another and then brush them with the brush while they were wet and create these, I think of now as kind of slick color experiences that were like slicked up Rothko. The colors were like Rothko. And I really learned so unbelievably large amount of stuff by night after night working on these watercolors and seeing really the personality of the different colors. And watercolor has a specific capability to take you inside color that opaque paint. It's harder to see. This is why when I mentioned that, like Edward Hopper is another one who used largely opaque color. When you know how to use opaque color accurately, it's very rare and it's palpable when you stand in front of that work, where you feel like the control and the knowledge of whoever's mixing those colors and where they're putting them is deeply exciting to experience. I mean, I know that we went to the opening of the Whitney Museum when they opened the new museum, and they had this painting, this Edward Hopper painting, that I chose to walk up and look at closely. I'd been a fan for quite a long time, but I was staring at just the walls in this painting and the shutters and the doors and the shadows. I knew you were going to ask that.
I'm a Hopper fan, and I know that room that you're talking about.
It's a painting of a building, and I think you look through maybe a window into a room. It's a white building. It's, if you were to go to whitney.org and look at Edward Hopper paintings that they own, it's in there.
Yeah.
But the point really for me was to see his use of color from one color to the next, to the next, to the next, is so deeply poetic. And also the knowledge that he had in mixing those colors is off the freaking charts. I gotta say, at least as much as Picasso, if not greater. And in my opinion, this is why Edward Hopper, to a large degree, is taken so seriously, because people who can see well feel in their bodies when they stand in front of his magical mixtures that he had awareness. I like to think of it as deep awareness that is intensely rare. And as I was making those early watercolors that were these stains, and they were subtle colors, over time, I realized that if I eliminated most of them here and there, but kept the sort of central colors that spoke to the other colors that I found interesting, that I would be able to throw a real fastball that would be a strike. So that's kind of what happened over quite a number of years, is to figure out what colors were the fastballs or the knockout punches that still had sensitivity. I'm not talking about just being aggressive, but that gave you the whole experience. That's what I've been trying to do.
Yeah. What's coming into my head while I'm hearing you say this stuff is talking about colors being next to other colors.
Yeah.
And it seems like when you started to take these paintings that at one point would have been two different paintings, I think, right? And then smushing them together onto one canvas.
Yeah.
There were probably surprises that happened coloristically.
Right.
like these two reds coming together, which are not the same red,
That's correct.
but they kind of vibrate next to each other, right? And I think like this orange next to that red and that yellow
Yeah.
is not maybe an intuitive choice, but a surprising choice. And it does something.
Well, yeah. Well, there is something to be said for making the decision to pull something that exists already and put it next to something that wasn't in your mind when you made number one part. It wasn't in your mind when you were making the number two part, putting them together and seeing what happens as a way of taking yourself forward. And then, as is the case with your typical painter who makes a brush mark, looks at it and then decides, no, I need to scrape that out and make that a different color. That same thing is happening. I will look at what I've just found by coming up with this experiment, and it'll make my mind think about how can I make it even more interesting, let's say, make it work better to my mind. But then, the funny thing about better is that there's always an argument to anything that you end up thinking is better. So I just try to, it's as simple as this. I try to make the best paintings I can all the time, every time. That's all I'm really interested in. So, and how does one decide what's the best painting they can make? Well, with the kind of work I make, these ideas come into my mind, and then I explore them, and then I take what seems to be like the ripest fruit from that exploration and make that painting.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things that we haven't really talked about is that because you have these, you said there are maybe 15 colors in the room, right? And there were a selection of these motifs that show up again and again. Is how does new stuff come in to the work? How do you break it up? How do you play in the studio and get new stuff in there? I mean, for this show, I think the new move, and we've talked about it already, but we haven't really quite called it out, is the infiltration, right?
Infiltration, definitely. Cross-fertilization. The idea that, yes, that's the new thing that I've been working on with for a while, and I'm particularly interested in. But I'm also using some earlier motifs, like the straight line painting that's on the left of the screen right now, that is red and blue with colors on the border. That painting may exist in a drawing. I think I made a drawing, or maybe I made a painting similar, but I didn't put the colors around the border. So the colors around the border are kind of like an infiltration. But I wanted one of those in the show because I just knew that, I'm making this squash soup, and that I want a little cinnamon in there. So I wanted that painting in the room, that kind of painting, but I didn't want to just remake the same painting. And originally, when I made that painting, the far border, the far outside border, was a pale kind of tropical blue. And as I would get across the room from it, it would kind of disappear. It would fuse into the yellow, and that was bothering me. So I changed it to the color it is now. But, the other thing is that I'm kind of a stream of consciousness guy. You'll notice when I talk, and maybe I'm trying harder now to be more, understandable because we're doing this video, but typically when I talk, the conversation bounces around a lot. So how does the new stuff come in? It's the mind of the guy who thinks like that, something new coming into his mind, and then asking himself, okay, is this something I want to explore? And if it is, because I've been doing that my whole life, things pop into my being, my mind, or wherever, and I feel something about the potential power of them. And then I make the choice to invest time, because, that little painting on the left there, because all the little areas are hand painted, like all the little white areas are all painted individually after I've painted the lines. And that's about 10 days of work making that painting. And I'm talking not just a couple hours a day. That painting has a lot of work in it. So if I'm going to invest in new territory, I have to have a pretty strong sense in my heart, really, that this is going to be worth it. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But it's an intuitive moving forward of making decisions about where I could go that is new. And that's another thing too, which is that because I make hard edge paintings, and I look at a lot of other kinds of paintings and often ask myself, well, why am I making hard edge paintings? Because I think gesture, when you move your arm, all right, and you make a mark like that, has, in a way, a greater power. It's like music. When you hear a certain song and you're in your car, will make you cry, but rarely will you look at a painting and be moved to tears. And so it really boils down to, I think this is what I can do best. That I understand. When I was in college, in art school, I had this teacher, this design teacher, who asked us to go home and just with circles and squares, make a painting that was colorful, just using circles and squares overlapping or whatever it meant to you. And that was so easy for me. When I came back to that class and we all put our works up on the wall, every artist has a way of thinking what they're doing is so great. That's a very dangerous place to go. But my painting stood out on that wall. And it was because it made sense to me. This territory that we were being asked to investigate made a lot of sense to me naturally. And so I also think that taking advantage of your strengths is a good idea, as opposed to always challenging yourself to do things that are not territory that you feel comfortable. In art school, that's promoted a lot, to like push the boundaries and so on. And I even question that, because I question how one can really teach art. So. Yeah.
Trying to think here, things that we have not touched on. And this idea of getting new things into the work. I remember this anecdote of a contortionist talking about how they got better, and they said, "Well, I get better just like anybody. I stretch."
Right.
They already have this massive talent, and they lean into that talent, and
Right.
they work it more.
Well, work more is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
But if you care, you can work and kind of not pay attention and not be serious about focusing on what you're doing. Or you can work and really, really pay attention. I remember James Sienna and saying to me about paying attention. So I think maybe his father used to say that to him. I think that's absolutely correct. So I take, I want to have a good time, but I take very seriously trying to take my work forward. And so, for example, as you look at the painting on the left there with that splat in the upper left-hand corner, the last show I had at Fredericks and Freiser, I had, the back room was all blue and red, paintings that were all blue and red. And they were simple. If you go back to the paintings on the other wall there and go in close on one of those, and you'll see that so for example, this one right here, in the lower section, the lower left-hand section, that would have been one of the paintings, different proportion, but this diamond with a rectangle in the center with a big X and then a border, all red, just simple, all right? But in the case of the new paintings, I've included all of these other elements on the top and on the left, and then this foreign body in the top center that's kind of functions as you could call it a signature or a head. Now, if you go back to the other one, all right, that we were looking at, all right, the blue one, the pale blue one, when I was making those blue paintings for the back room of Fredericks and Freiser, I had this strong sense that I wanted to put a splat somewhere in the painting as a little signature device. But because I didn't think it went with my show, it would be, and also because those those images were so pared down that to put a splat in there would have been too loud somehow. And I was even thinking of a yellow splat in these blue and red paintings. And I couldn't find a way to make it make sense, but it was on my mind like 3 years ago. So when I started placing on top of one another these geometric paintings, these what I called wonder wheels, these pale blue paintings with 16 rectangles or squares on top of one another, where you would get this double line of blocks. Then all of a sudden, because of those double line of blocks, somehow the idea of including a splat in that painting seemed to make sense to me, that I could fit it in there and not have it be so foreign that it didn't belong. And you know, I'm a careful guy, so these decisions are not reckless. Although I do love great reckless art that's accurate. You know, if somebody is very accurate with their choices, to me it's all good. I'm a big Cy Twombly fan. One guy said to me one time that, did you know that Cy Twombly was Elmer Fudd's favorite artist? He said that in one of my classes while walking through, and I have to say I found that to be unbelievably funny. So, for example, with this painting, the splat in the upper left-hand corner, it's this dark blue, and typically with my splats, there's a border around them, which is the same color as the splat form. So in this case, there would be a white line around it. But because the white line would create a divot in the top edge of the painting, I decided to remove that white line. And I like go back to the yellow painting on the opposite wall, the big yellow Hutter Bloing painting. And you'll see there's a white line around the outside. It's a border line, okay? And those border lines are very important to me because they take the painting slightly less from the place of space, a spatial experience, into the place of an object, like a game board. A lot of game boards have like some kind of border on them. And I like the idea of seeing my work as an object, not entirely, but a significant part of it.
And not solely as an image or a spatial experience. Yeah.
Correct. And I like the idea, like those ovals, the way they fill the rectangle. Just to the left of that, it's, you know, stuffed with the ovals all to this. In a way, that's kind of, again, this logical geometry that has intuition, because those ovals are hand-drawn and they're all different, and they're configured in a way to make them feel balanced and right within that rectangle. But they fill the thing all the way to the edge, which is in keeping with a lot of the things that interest me.
We should probably wrap up soon. I'm wondering if you want to talk at all about the index paintings. They're not in this show, but were a necessary, I think, precursor to the.
Yeah, so the index paintings are a continuation of this idea taken to a further extreme. And I decided for this show that I was going to back that up a little bit. And I think that the territory that I discovered from doing that is extremely exciting to me, just as exciting as the index paintings. And in fact, I plan to have a show with index paintings in the back room of the gallery in New York. And I plan to have the front room very much related to this show, where paintings like that Farstisch Trinka, or if you look at the painting on the right here, which is called Prom Waltz Ming, it's that little square one with the blue at the bottom and the black at the top. All right, and that's a made-up name, obviously. You know, I might have in the front room a 40-inch square version of something like that, where the colors are rearranged a little bit in the bottom. It wouldn't be the same painting, but the point is, these paintings, which are in between my earlier paintings and the index paintings, make completely huge sense to me, and I'm not going to stop making them. I'm excited by this being a step, part of the steps. And then I don't know where I'm going to take the index paintings. I mean, the blue paintings that you have in this show are kind of index paintings.
Yeah.
They have more going on. But I felt that they would survive in this show as a group because they were just red and blue. If I wouldn't think when an index painting in this show would, it's funny, people say, do you sign your work? Where do you sign your work? And some people will think that, people who don't know art necessarily say, why don't you sign it on the front? And well, with the kind of work I make, a signature, your eye would just go directly to it.
Mm-hmm.
So an index painting in this show, the only way it could survive if it was pared down to red and blue, at least my thinking when I decided to make those. And I absolutely love those paintings. And in fact, one of those paintings, I was asked to make a rug with someone who works with these weavers in Nepal. And they made this beautiful hand-loomed Nepalese wool rug with, I think there's some silk in it too, of one of those blue paintings that I really am. I've not actually seen it in person. I've seen photos. It looks fantastic.
Yeah, they do. They do look really good. All right. Well, should we sign off?
Hey, Michael, this has been great. I really thought that went well.
Yeah, I did too. More things come out every time we talk.
Here's the problem. You forgot to hit record.
No, it's recording. No, it's recording. It's recording. I promise you. That would be so bad.
Wouldn't it? Yeah. Could you just say that one more time? Okay. Good job. We did it. Good.
And if so I don't know if you were on Cary's email, but I will stop recording.